The scan came back wrong, and Archivist Vel read it 3 times before he let himself breathe. He sat alone on the cold survey deck of the cataloging vessel Patient Ledger, his 6 fingers hovering over a panel that had never once given him a number it could not place. For 200 years the ledger had drifted the dead edge of the Quion Reach, measuring abandoned hulks, tagging old wrecks, filing every hull in the galaxy into the Great Index. That was its only purpose. That was Vel's only purpose. Measure the thing, name the thing, file the thing, and move on. Nothing in the void had ever refused to be filed. The object on the screen refused. "Run it again," he said, though there was no one to run it. His voice came out thin in the empty deck. The instrument obeyed him, because instruments always obeyed. A pale ring of light swept the cube of space ahead, 300 kilometers out, where a single shape hung dark against the dust. The return painted itself across his panel in clean lines, and the clean lines made no sense. The mass reading said one thing, the length reading said another, the density reading said a third, and the third was impossible. The hull was denser than any metal in the index, layer over layer over layer, and yet it was old. Cold. It had been sitting in that exact spot, the drift log said, for longer than Vel's species had owned ships. He pulled the index open and typed the silhouette into the search field with hands that had stopped feeling steady. Wedge prow, long spine, a tower set high on the back like a fortress on a hill. Gun batteries down both flanks, hundreds of them, dark and patient. He typed it all and pressed the key and waited for the index to tell him what it was. The index returned nothing. 200 million entries. Every warship, freighter, station, probe and lifeboat any civilization had ever built, and any salvager had ever found. 200 million. And the search field blinked back at him, empty, the way it had never once blinked in his life. No origin, he whispered. No class. No maker. He widened the search. He told the index to ignore exact matches and find anything close. Any hull that shared even a quarter of the silhouette. Any prow that came near that shape. Any spine that long. The index loved partial matches. It would offer 40 cousins to any ship a salvager dragged in. It offered him nothing. Not a cousin, not a fragment, not a guess. The shape on his screen had no relatives in 200 million entries. It was not a variant of anything. It was a first thing, and the index did not believe in first things, because the whole faith of the index was that everything had been seen before and filed before, and was therefore owned before. He should have flagged it and moved on. The procedure was clear. An unindexed object got a temporary tag, a low-priority queue slot, and a note for the next survey cycle. That was the rule. Vel had filed 10,000 objects by that rule, and never broken it. Instead, he leaned closer to the glass and looked at the thing with his own eyes. It was enormous. The ledger's optics finally focused, and the dark wedge filled the frame, and Vel felt his throat tighten. 4 kilometers, the rangefinder said. 4 kilometers of armored hull, scarred and pitted and streaked, the paint long gone, the metal beneath gone gray with age, and with something that looked like burns, old burns. The kind a ship carried when it had survived something that should have killed it. There were holes in the flank where weapons had punched through and never been repaired, and around each hole the metal was buckled outward, not inward, as if the ship had been hit from inside and shrugged. He had catalogued 10,000 wrecks. Wrecks were quiet. Wrecks were finished things. This was not finished. This was waiting. He tried to date it. Dating a hull was the simplest thing an archivist did. You measured the dust on the plating, the slow creep of cosmic wear, the decay of the markers every metal carried, and the numbers told you how long a thing had drifted. Vel ran the measurement, and the numbers came back, and he ran it again, because the numbers were not the kind of wrong he was used to. They were not too high. They were too consistent. Every wreck in the Reach wore its age unevenly, more weathered on the side that faced the local sun, less on the side that lay in shadow, the dust thicker where the drift had carried it, and thinner where the solar wind had scoured it. This hull wore its age perfectly evenly, on every face, as if it had not drifted at all, as if it had been set down in this exact patch of dust, and had held that patch, unmoving, against the wind and the wear, for the entire span of its impossible age. Nothing held still that long. Things in the void drifted. That was the first law a survey clerk learned. This one had refused even that. He looked closer still, plate by plate, walking the 4-kilometer flank the way he walked a long entry. The closer he looked, the less the thing made sense. The buckled holes were not battle damage in any pattern he knew. They were spaced, regular, as if something had reached out and tested the hull at measured intervals. Here, and here, and here, and the hull had let itself be tested, and then closed the conversation, because around each old wound, the metal had flowed and resealed in a way no shipyard in the Reach could manage. Smooth and seamless and gray, a scar that had healed. Wrecks did not heal. Wrecks rusted and opened and gave up their insides to the dark. This one had been hurt, long ago, by something that could hurt a hull denser than any metal in the index. And it had survived, and it had healed, and then it had lain down in the dust and held perfectly still for an age. Vel could not decide which of those facts frightened him most. He told himself there was a difference between a thing that waits and a thing that is simply still, and he told himself the difference was in his own nerves and not in the metal. The metal did nothing. The metal had done nothing for, by the drift logs, longer than the concord of patient stars had existed. A thing that has done nothing for that long is not a threat. It is furniture. He repeated that to himself. Furniture, an old dead hull, a long entry, and an early night, and his throat stayed tight anyway, because 200 years of reading instruments had taught him to trust the part of himself that knew a thing before he could prove it, and that part of him was looking at the wedge and refusing to call it dead. A second console chimed. The ledger's passive sensors had found a marking on the hull, faint, half worn away, and the cataloging software did what it always did, and tried to read it and assign it a registry. Vel watched the letters resolve. They were not letters he knew. They were sharp, simple shapes, an alphabet the index had no entry for, and beneath them ran a string of marks that the software guessed were a name. The software guessed. It put the guess on his screen in the calm gray font the ledger used for everything. The name it offered was Iron Verdict. Vel did not know what the words meant. He knew only that the software had never guessed a name before. It matched names. It did not invent them. To guess, it had reached into its deepest pattern library, the one built from the oldest fragments of the oldest dead languages, the layer the clerks called the floor, because nothing was filed beneath it, and it had found the closest shape it could, and that was the shape it gave him. Iron Verdict. He said it once, quietly, and disliked the way it sat in his mouth. It did not sound like a registry. It sounded like a sentence handed down. He keyed the long-range relay to the Index Authority, the body that governed all cataloging across the Reach, the body Vel had served his whole adult life. He composed the report in the formal style they required. Unindexed hull, 4 kilometers, origin unknown, class unknown, age exceeding survey baseline, no partial matches in 200 million entries, name not matched, name guessed from the floor library, recommend priority escalation. He read it back and felt foolish for the tremor in it, and he sent it anyway, and then he sat in the dark and waited for the authority to tell him he was being dramatic. The reply came faster than any reply ever had. It did not come from the duty clerk. It came from the office of the prime cataloger herself, Sodaru Mayeth, whose seal Vel had seen perhaps twice in 2 centuries, and whose words now filled his screen in red, the color the authority used only for orders that could not be questioned. Do not approach. Do not scan again. Hold position. A fleet is coming. Vel read it 3 times, the way he had read the first scan 3 times, and for the same reason, because the words were simple and the meaning was not. A fleet. The Index Authority did not own a fleet. It owned survey ships and clerks, and the largest archive in the galaxy. When it needed force, it borrowed it from the concord of patient stars, the great power that ruled the Reach, the power that had 30,000 warships and had not lost a war in 800 years. For the authority to summon the concord over a single wreck, the authority had to be afraid. And the authority was never afraid. The authority filed. It measured the universe and put the universe in boxes, and the boxes never frightened it, because a thing you have measured is a thing you have mastered. That was the whole faith of Vel's people. Name it, and it is yours. He had believed it the way a stone believes in the ground. He had built 200 years on it. He had never once, in all that time, filed a thing and felt that the thing was watching him do it. They had not named this. The index had blinked empty. The software had been forced to guess from the floor. Vel looked back through the glass at the 4-kilometer wedge that should not be there, that was in no archive, that carried a name no living tongue had spoken, and he understood, in a slow, cold way, that for the first time in 200 years, he was looking at something that had measured him first. The thought did not arrive as words. It arrived the way the tightness in his throat had arrived, ahead of proof, certain. The wedge had been here when his ship came over the dust. It had let his ring of survey light wash across it once, twice, 3 times. It had let him search the index and find nothing. It had let him send his report. It had permitted all of it, the way a deep thing permits a small fish to swim across its eye, and the permission was the most frightening fact on his screen. Far behind the dark hull, deep in the dust of the Quion Reach, a single point of light woke in one of the dead gun batteries. Just one. A small dim ember in all that ruin, as if the ship had heard the relay and opened one eye. Vel did not log it. His hands would not move. He simply watched the ember burn, and he counted his own breaths, and he waited for the fleet the Authority had promised, and he prayed to the index that it would arrive before the ember became a second one. The Concorde fleet arrived 11 hours later, and the first thing it did was scan the wreck, because that was what the Concorde always did to a thing it did not understand. Vel watched it happen from the patient ledger, holding station at the edge as ordered, his survey deck now crowded with relayed feeds from the warships that had filled the dust around him. There were 200 of them. He counted, because counting was what he did. 200 Concorde battle hulls in a loose sphere around the dark wedge, their armor bright and clean, and lettered with proud registries the index knew by heart. Their guns run out, their reactors singing in the passive band loud enough that the ledger's instruments flinched. 200 ships built in the last century, crewed by the finest the Concorde trained, commanded from the lead dreadnought Throne of Measure by Fleet Warden Tessa Corrin of the Concorde line. Vel did not know Tessa Corrin, but he knew her reputation, and he knew her voice the moment it came across the fleet channel, because it was the voice of someone who had never lost. "Survey vessel," she said. "You are Archivist Vel." "I am." "You found this object." "I logged it. I did not touch it. The Authority ordered me not to scan again." "The Authority is cautious," Corrin said, and there was something close to amusement in it. "We are not the Authority. We measure with our guns. Hold your station, Archivist, and watch how a professional files a wreck." Vel wanted to tell her not to scan it. He could not have said why. The ember he had seen in the dead gun battery had gone out hours ago, and the wreck had not moved, had not signaled, had done nothing at all but hang there in the dust, being 4 kilometers long, and being in no archive. There was no reason to be afraid of a thing that did nothing, and yet his throat was tight again, and his hands were cold, and the word the software had guessed kept turning in his head. Iron verdict. He opened his channel to say something. Anything. "Fleet Warden," he managed. "Before you scan, the Authority sent 200 ships for a derelict. It does not do that. It has never done that in my service. Whatever frightened the Prime Cataloger, it did not frighten her by being dead. I would ask you to read the object passively first, the way a survey ship reads it, and see what it does before you touch it with anything harder." "I have read your report, Archivist." Corrin's voice stayed light. "No match in 200 million, a guest name, an old hull with old holes. I have filed 1,000 old hulls. They are all impossible, until you measure them, and then they are just metal. I am going to measure this one properly. Hold your station." The Concorde fleet would not be told. Vel had known it would not. He sat back on the cold deck and did the only thing left, which was to set every passive instrument the ledger owned to record. Because if no one would listen to him before, perhaps the recording would make someone listen after. The Throne of Measure scanned the wreck. It was not a survey scan. It was a war scan. A hard, active sweep, meant to strip an enemy hull down to its bones, to read every plate and every gun and every gram of fuel, the kind of scan the Concorde used the instant before it opened fire, so that it would know exactly where to aim. A lance of focused energy crossed the dust and touched the dark wedge from prow to stern. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the wreck answered. It did not fire. Vel understood that distinction later, when he had time to be sick about it. The wreck did not shoot back. It simply turned the scan around. The hard, active sweep that the throne of measure had sent out came back, every photon of it, focused and folded and aimed down the exact line it had arrived on, and the throne's own scanning array, the most sensitive instrument in the fleet, took the full return into itself. The array did not survive. It overloaded in a flash of white that Vel saw clearly across 300 kilometers, a small bright star blooming on the flank of the lead dreadnought, and where the array had been, there was now a glowing crater and a long line of dead sensor towers. The fleet channel filled with voices. Damage on the throne, sensor section, total loss. It reflected the scan. It reflected the whole scan back at us. That is not possible. Nothing reflects a war sweep. The energy is too high. It cooks anything it touches. It cooked us, Corin said, and her voice had changed. It was still level. The Concorde trained level into its officers, the way Vel's people trained tidiness. But under the level there was a new thing, a small thing, and Vel, who had spent 200 years listening to the universe answer his instruments, knew exactly what it was. It was the sound of someone who had just learned that the rule they had built their life on was not a rule. He looked at the wreck. It had not moved. The reflected scan had cost it nothing. It had not even bothered to fire. It had taken the hardest look the Concorde could throw and handed it back the way a mirror hands back a face, and the lesson in that was so plain that Vel felt it in his bones. You may not look at me with anything I cannot return. A long silence stretched across the fleet. In that silence, Vel did the only thing he knew how to do. He scanned the wreck himself, gently, passively, the survey way, the way that only listened and never touched. And what he heard made him sit very still. The wreck was warming up. Not the whole ship. That would have been a fleet-killing reactor surge, and the fleet would have seen it and fired first. This was smaller and far more frightening. All along the 4-kilometer hull, in the hundreds of dark gun batteries that had hung dead and cold for longer than his species had owned ships, embers were waking. 1, then 4, then 40, then a slow rolling tide of them, each one a small dim point of orange in the gray ruin, until the whole flank of the wreck was lit from within like a coal bank breathing. The ship was not powering up to fight. The ship had been asleep, and the war scan had been a hand on its shoulder, and now it was opening its eyes one battery at a time, in no hurry at all, the way a thing wakes when it knows nothing in the room can hurt it. Fleet Warden, Vel said into the channel, and was surprised to hear his own voice. It is waking. The gun batteries. All of them. I count 310 so far, and the number is rising. I see it, Archivist. My recommendation is to withdraw. Noted and declined. A pause. We do not withdraw from a wreck. If we withdraw from a wreck, every power in the Reach will hear that the Concorde ran from a derelict, and we will spend the next century proving we are not afraid of the dark. We will measure this thing properly. We will take it apart and put it in your index, Archivist, and the index will swallow it like it swallows everything, and the galaxy will go back to making sense. Corin's voice firmed. All ships, target the hull, disable the waking batteries before they reach full power. Fire on my mark. Vel wanted to scream at her that you do not measure a thing by hitting it, that the war scan had already been a kind of hitting, and look what it had cost, that the wreck had reflected a beam meant to cook a city and had not even warmed up, and that whatever a ship could do to a scan, it could surely do to a shell. He wanted to say all of it. He said none of it, because he was an archivist on a survey ship at the edge of a battle, and no one was waiting for his opinion. He simply watched, and counted, and recorded, because in the end, recording was the only thing he had ever been for. The Concorde fleet fired. 200 warships opened up at once, the way they had been drilled, a single coordinated volley meant to overwhelm any defense by sheer arithmetic. Vel's instruments whited out and recovered, and showed him the storm. Thousands of rounds crossed the dust toward the dark wedge, kinetic slugs and energy lances and clusters of guided fire, more firepower in 1 second than the Quion Reach had seen in 100 years, all of it aimed at one old ship that had refused to be filed. The wreck raised a wall. That was how Vel logged it later, because that was what it looked like, and the index had no better word. Across the 4-kilometer flank, between the waking gun batteries, a sheet of something came up. It was not a shield the way the Concorde built shields, a bubble of energy that drank a hit and dimmed. It was flat and hard, and it appeared the instant before the volley arrived, as if the ship had simply decided that the space in front of it would now be solid. The Concorde volley struck the wall and stopped. Not dimmed. Stopped. The way a thrown stone stops against a cliff. The energy of 200 warships flaring along a flat gray plain and going nowhere. And then the wall was gone again, as quickly as it had come, and behind it, the dark wedge hung exactly where it had been, unmarked. The embers in its batteries still brightening in their slow, unhurried way. "Confirm hits," Corin said. "No hits, Fleet Warden. 0. The volley was stopped before contact." "Stopped by what?" "Unknown. It is not in the index. There is no entry for what it just did." There was that small thing in her voice again. "Then make one," she said. "That is your job. Make an entry. Tell me what we are fighting." And Vel, looking at the warming wreck, the reflected scan, the wall that had eaten 200 warships' fury and not flickered, found that he could. The entry assembled itself in his head with the cold clarity that came over him at his best, the clarity he had served 200 years to earn. He spoke it into the channel slowly, because he wanted her to hear every word. "It is not a wreck, Fleet Warden. It was never a wreck. The damage on its hull is old, because it is old, but a thing can be old and not be finished. It has been sitting in this dust holding still, drawing no power, signaling nothing, doing the one thing that keeps a predator from being seen, which is being patient. The Authority did not send for you because it feared a derelict. The Authority sent for you because somewhere in its oldest, deepest records, in a fragment too damaged to file, it found a shape that matched this one, and the shape frightened it so badly that it spent a fleet to be sure." He drew a breath. "It is a warship. It has been awake the whole time, and it let us scan it twice before it answered, the way a strong thing lets a small thing test the bars before it decides whether to mind." The channel was quiet. "Your recommendation," Corin said at last. "Leave. Now. Before it finishes waking. We do not have the firepower to file this. Nothing in the Reach has the firepower to file this. I have watched it ignore 2 scans and a fleet volley, and not raise its own guns. It has 310 batteries awake, and 4 kilometers of hull, and a name the Index had to invent, because no living language remembers it, and it is not afraid of us, Fleet Warden. It has not done one single thing that a frightened ship does. We are the only frightened ones here." There was a silence on the channel that Vel would remember for the rest of his life, because it was the silence of 200 warships full of trained, certain people, all arriving at the same unwelcome thought at the same moment. Then a younger officer broke it, the way the young always broke a silence, with a plan. "Fleet Warden, request permission to attempt a boarding. The hull is not firing. It reflects, it walls, but it has taken no aggressive action against a closing ship. If we cannot read it from outside, we put a team inside. We have done it to 100 derelicts. Whatever runs that ship, we find it, and we shut it off at the source." Vel wanted to tell the young officer that you do not walk into the mouth of a thing that has been patient for an age. He did not get the chance. Corin, perhaps because she needed to do something other than retreat, perhaps because a part of her still believed the universe was a thing you could reach out and touch and master, granted it. Approved. 1 boarding shuttle. Slow approach. Do not fire. Do not scan. Knock, do not break. The shuttle launched from a cruiser near the wedge, a small bright shape crossing the dust toward 4 kilometers of gray armor, and Vel watched it on every instrument he had, and could not make his hands stop shaking. The shuttle closed to 1 kilometer, to 500 meters, to 100, drifting now, looking for a hatch, a breach, any of the buckled openings in the flank that might let a team inside. It found one of the old healed wounds, a seam in the plating, and edged toward it. The wedge did not raise a wall. It did not reflect anything. It did something Vel had not seen, and had no entry for. The seam in the plating, the old scar, simply opened, smoothly, the healed metal parting like a slow eye, and inside there was not a corridor, and not a chamber, and not machinery but light. A deep, steady orange light, the same color as the embers in the batteries, filling the opening from edge to edge, and the boarding shuttle's instruments, relayed back to the fleet, recorded for 1/2 of 1 second the inside of the iron verdict before they failed. What they recorded was that the ship was not hollow. There were no decks. There were no rooms for a crew, no corridors, no place for hands to work. The 4 kilometers of armored hull were solid the whole way through, dense and warm and humming, layer over layer over layer of the impossible metal, and threaded through all of it, in patterns too regular to be anything but deliberate, ran channels of the orange light, branching and rejoining like the veins of something alive. It was not a vessel that carried a crew. It was a vessel that was a crew. A single thing 4 kilometers long, built solid, built to last an age in the dust, built with no soft inside for a boarding team to find, because it had never needed one. Then the eye in the plating closed, smoothly, the scar sealing itself again, and the boarding shuttle's systems came back, and the team inside was unharmed, and the shuttle was undamaged, and they had been shown the inside of the thing, and told, without a word, that there was nothing in there to shut off. The shuttle turned and ran for the fleet, and no one ordered it to stop. "It let us look," Vel said into the channel, very quietly. "Do you understand what that means, Fleet Warden? It opened itself and let us look inside, the way it let us scan, the way it raised the wall, and then it closed again, unharmed, and told us there is nothing in there to find. There is no captain to negotiate with. There is no reactor to disable. There is no bridge to take. It is solid all the way through. It is not a ship that has a will. It is a will that has a ship, and it has decided, for now, to be patient. I am asking you, while it is still being patient, to leave." The channel did not answer at once. Across 200 warships, Vel could feel the recording he was making fill with the small sounds of a fleet that no longer knew what it was looking at. Someone, far off, was reading the boarding shuttle's half-second of data aloud in a flat voice, listing what it had found and what it had not found, and the listing got shorter and shorter as the officer realized how little there was to say. Solid hull, no decks, no crew spaces, no reactor signature in any band the fleet knew. A will that has a ship. The phrase Vel had spoken was already moving through the fleet from channel to channel, the way a true thing moves, and he heard it come back to him twice in other voices, lower each time. "Confirm the boarding data," Corin said, and her voice had gone careful, the way a person's voice goes careful on thin ice. "Confirmed, Fleet Warden. The hull is solid throughout. The interior light is structural, not a power core we can target. There is no command center. There is nothing we can board, nothing we can disable, nothing we can take. And it returned our shuttle unharmed. Unharmed. Untouched. It opened. It showed us. It closed. It made no move to keep the team or to follow them back." Corin was quiet for a long moment, and in that quiet, Vel heard the whole 800 years of Concord certainty grinding against a single new fact. The Concorde measured with its guns. It had a way to file every enemy it had ever met, because every enemy it had ever met had a place where you put the shot that ended it, a reactor, a bridge, a captain, a heart. This had none. There was nowhere to aim. You could empty the entire fleet into it, and you would only be sending it more of yourself to give back. Vel let the silence run because he knew, this time, that she had heard him, that the measurer in her had finally measured the thing correctly, and that she was, in that long quiet, about to do the unthinkable and order the Concorde to turn around. She drew the breath. Vel heard it. The whole fleet heard it. And in the half-second before the order to withdraw could leave her, a new voice cut into the channel, sharp and high and certain, and the breath she had drawn went out of her unused. It was the office of the Prime Cataloger. Sodaru Mayeth herself, patched through from the authority's seat half a galaxy away, watching the feeds, and her order overrode them both. "The Concorde will not withdraw," Mayeth said. "I will not have it recorded that we found an unindexed warship and fled. We will measure it, or we will destroy it, and either way it will go in the index, because that is the law of the Reach, and the law does not bend for an old ship. Fleet Warden Corin, you will hold position, and you will reduce that hull to debris small enough to catalog. If 200 ships are not enough, I am sending more. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Corin said, and Vel heard, in the flatness of it, that she did not believe it would work, and that she would do it anyway, because that was what the law of her life required. "More?" Vel said. "How many more?" "The full home reserve," Maith said, as if it were nothing. "I have ordered the standing fleet of the Concord of Patient Stars to muster on this position. Every hull we have. 30,000 warships. Let the wreck reflect that, Archivist. Let it raise a wall against the whole Concord at once, and we will see how patient it truly is. By the time they arrive, your impossible ship will be the largest single entry the Index has ever recorded. A wreck that took 30,000 to file. They will teach it in the academies for 1,000 years. Vel looked at his screen. 30,000 warships. The entire armed strength of the power that ruled the Reach, summoned across the stars to bury one old wedge of gray metal that had been lying in the dust minding its own affairs, until a fleet woke it with a scan it should never have sent. He tried, one last time, to make her hear it. Prime Cataloger, with respect, you are not sending 30,000 ships to destroy a threat. You are sending 30,000 ships to protect a belief. The threat has done nothing but defend itself, and let us look inside, and hand back our shuttle whole. The belief is that nothing in the universe can exist outside the Index. The belief is wrong, and the ships will not make it right. They will only make the lesson larger. The belief, Mayeth said coldly, is the foundation of everything we are. And you of all clerks should know that a thing unfiled is a thing uncontrolled. I am not protecting a belief, Archivist. I am protecting order. Hold your station and record. That is what you are for. The channel closed. Vel looked at the wreck. Iron Verdict. The name turned in his head one more time. And now, for the first time, he thought he understood it. Not a wreck. Not a class. A judgment, rendered long ago by hands no living archive remembered, sealed into 4 kilometers of armor, and set adrift to wait. The batteries along its flank had all woken now. 512 of them by his count, every one alight, the whole hull breathing orange in the dark. And as he watched, the great wedge did the only new thing it had done since the boarding shuttle fled. It turned. Slowly, with no flare of engines he could read, the 4-kilometer hull came around in the dust until its knife-edge prow pointed away from the gathered fleet and away from the patient ledger. Out toward the deep dark of the Reach, toward the long road the Concorde's 30,000 would come down. It was not turning to flee. Vel knew that the way he knew his own name. It was turning to face the door. The first 10,000 came down the Reach, in a column 9 days later, and the Iron Verdict let them get close before it spoke. Vel had not left. He told himself it was duty, that the authority required an archivist on station to record the engagement, that the data of 30,000 ships filing a single wreck would be the most valuable entry in the Index for 1,000 years, and someone had to witness it cleanly. All of that was true. None of it was why he stayed. He stayed because he could not look away from the thing that had measured him, and because some small part of him, the part that had loved cataloging not for the power of it, but for the wonder of finding a thing no one had found, wanted to be there when the galaxy learned what it had woken. In those 9 days the wreck did nothing. Vel watched it every hour, the way a clerk watches the one number on a sheet that refuses to add up. It held its turned position, prow out toward the deep dark, batteries lit and steady, drawing only enough power to keep the embers warm. It did not signal. It did not scan. It did not so much as drift. He sent it 3 gentle survey pings across the 9 days, the listening kind, and each time the pings came back unchanged, as if the dust had swallowed them, and he understood that the ship was choosing not to answer a thing that had not threatened it. The realization sat strangely in him. He had spent 200 years deciding what was worth filing and what was not, and now, for 9 days, he had been weighed by a 4-kilometer hull and found not worth a reply. The Concorde muster filled the dark. Vel's instruments could not hold all of it at once. The lead column alone was 10,000 hulls, and behind it, the relay told him another 10,000 were forming up, and another behind that, the full standing strength of the Concorde of patient stars, draining out of 100 home systems and pouring down the Quion Reach toward one fixed point. He had filed fleets before. He had never filed a number like this. The mass reading of the muster was a significant fraction of a small star. It was, he thought, the single largest assembly of warships the galaxy had seen in 8 centuries, and every one of them was here to bury a derelict. Fleet Warden Corrin commanded the lead column from the repaired throne of measure. Her voice across the channel had not warmed in 9 days. All ships. The wreck has not moved since the muster began, she said. It holds position, prow out, batteries lit. It has not fired. It has not signaled. Whatever it is, It is waiting for us to come to it, and we are obliging. Forward elements, advance to firing range. We will open at 1,000 kilometers, and we will not stop until there is nothing left to stop on. There was a thing in the way she said it that Vel caught, and no one else seemed to. She did not say, "We will win." A commander who believed she would win said so, to her ships, because belief was a weapon too. Corin said only what they would do and how far, and she did not promise the end of it. And Vel understood that somewhere in the 9 days she had come to expect what was coming, and had decided to obey the Prime Cataloger anyway, because the alternative was to be the Fleet Warden who fled a derelict, and she would rather be a Fleet Warden who died than one who fled. It was a kind of courage. It was also, Vel thought, the exact disease the Iron Verdict had woken to cure. The forward elements advanced. 3,000 hulls slid ahead of the column, beautiful and bright and certain, the pride of the Concord, more firepower than any enemy in the Reach had ever faced and lived. Vel watched them close the distance and felt the old tightness in his throat become something colder. At 1,000 kilometers, the Iron Verdict spoke. It was not a voice. The ship had no voice the index could read. Whatever crew had built it and named it and sealed the judgment into it were long past speaking. What the ship sent was simpler than language. It sent a single pulse, a tight beam of patterned energy that crossed the 1,000 kilometers in an eye blink and touched the lead hull of the forward elements, the cruiser Faithful Margin, and the Faithful Margin stopped. Not exploded, stopped. Every reading from the cruiser flatlined at once. Reactor, engines, weapons, life support, all of it, in the same instant, as if a hand had reached into the ship and turned a single switch that the Concorde did not know existed and had never thought to guard. The Faithful Margin went dark and cold and drifted, 3,000 of her crew suddenly silent, and the pulse moved on. It crossed to the next hull and the next, and each one it touched went dark in the same heartbeat. No fire, no flare, no debris, just ship after ship after ship, falling silent and still in the dust. A line of dead lights spreading through the forward elements, faster than the order to scatter could be given. Scatter, Corin said anyway, far too late. All forward ships, full evasive, break formation. They could not evade it. Vel understood the horror of it as he recorded it. The pulse was not a weapon you dodged. It did not fly through space like a shell. It arrived where it was aimed, and the ship had no trouble aiming, and the only limit on how many it could touch was how fast it cared to work. And it did not care to work fast. It moved through the 3,000 forward hulls at a steady, unhurried pace, one ship every few seconds, the same pace at which its batteries had woken 9 days before, the pace of a thing that has all the time there is, and no reason to rush. In 4 minutes, the forward elements of the Concord of Patient Stars, 3,000 of the finest warships in the Reach, hung dead and dark and intact in the dust, every one of them whole, every one of them silent, like a shelf of specimens carefully switched off and set aside. It had not destroyed them. Vel saw that, and saw what it meant, and felt the cold reach all the way through him. A thing that destroys is angry, or afraid, or hungry. A thing that switches you off and sets you aside is none of those. It is sorting. It had taken 3,000 warships and filed them, neatly, without a mark, the way Vel himself filed a wreck, and the obscene mirror of it made his vision swim. The galaxy had come to catalog the Iron Verdict. The Iron Verdict was cataloging the galaxy. Fleet Warden, he said into the channel, and his voice shook, and he let it. It is not killing them. Check your dead hulls, the crews, check life support before the order to write them off. A pause, then a different officer, somewhere in the column, in a voice gone strange, confirmed. Life support nominal on the dark hulls. Crews are alive. Ships are simply off. Everything is off. We cannot turn anything back on. It is as if the ships were never built to be turned off, and now they will not turn on. Alive, Corin repeated. Alive and helpless, Vel said. It did not come to kill you, Fleet Warden. It does not need to. It came to file you, and a file does not have to be dead. It only has to be still. He drew a breath and made himself say the rest, the part he had worked out in the 9 days of watching. Listen to me, because I have watched this thing longer than anyone alive. It has done you no harm it could not undo. Every ship it has touched is whole. Every crew it has stilled is breathing. It is showing you, in the gentlest language it has, exactly what it is capable of, and it is giving you the chance to read the message and stop. That is mercy, Fleet Warden. That is the only mercy it will offer. Take it. Withdraw. I am begging you with the full weight of 200 years of recording the universe. Whatever judgment this ship was built to render, you have not yet earned the worst of it, because it is being gentle, and you do not want to learn what it does when it stops being gentle. Turn the column around. For 9 days, Corin had refused him. Now, with 3,000 of her ships floating dark in the dust, and the rest of her column slowing in raw animal hesitation, Vel heard her come to the edge of agreeing. He heard her draw the breath to give the order to withdraw. The whole column hung on that breath. 10,000 warships, slowed and waiting, every commander on the channel silent, the dust lit by the dead lights of 3,000 stilled hulls, and at the center of it, one fleet warden, about to do the one thing her law forbade, and her reason demanded. For the length of one held breath, Vel believed the word had been given. He saw the lead elements of the second column slow on his instruments, saw the formation loosen as captains eased off their burns, saw the great machine of the Concorde begin, just begin, to turn. 200 years of watching the universe had taught him what a fleet looked like in the instant it decided to live. This was that instant. He let himself believe it. He should have known the belief would not be allowed to stand, because the thing that ruled the Concorde was not its fleet warden, and not its captains, and not the cold reason of the people who flew the ships. The thing that ruled the Concorde was the faith of the Index, and the faith had a voice, and the voice was patched through from half a galaxy away, watching, and it had been waiting for exactly this moment, the moment a measurer almost admitted there was a thing she could not measure. Vel could see, on the dead column, what the faith would have to ignore to give its next order. 3,000 warships, dark and whole, drifting in the dust with their crews alive inside them. 9,000 people to a heavy hull, more on the cruisers, fewer on the frigates. He did the arithmetic without meaning to, because arithmetic was a comfort, and he needed one. Millions of people, switched off and set aside, breathing in the dark, waiting to be turned back on, by hands that could not find the switch. Not one of them harmed, every one of them a warning, written in the gentlest language the iron verdict had, and the warning said the same thing his every instrument said, which was leave. A reasonable power would have read 3,000 intact hulls and understood that it had been spared on purpose, and that being spared on purpose was the most dangerous mercy in the universe, because it meant the thing sparing you had chosen to, and could choose otherwise. Corin had read it. Vel heard it in her silence. She had read the dead column the way he had, and she had drawn the breath to act on it. And the prime cataloger overrode her again. "It is afraid to kill," Sodaru Mayeth said, and her voice rang with a terrible relief, because she had found a box to put the impossible thing in, and the box made her feel safe again. "Do you not see it, Corin? It disables. It does not destroy. It cannot destroy, or it would have. It is a containment device, an old defensive engine, powerful, but bound by some ancient limit against killing. We have measured it after all. It switches ships off. Very well. We will send so many that switching them off one at a time will not matter. Push the second column through the gaps in the first. Push the third behind it. Bury it in hulls faster than it can sort them. It cannot file 30,000 ships one at a time before 30,000 sets of guns are in range. Arithmetic, Corin. The law is arithmetic, and arithmetic does not bend." It was, Vel thought, the most reasonable wrong thing he had ever heard. And he understood, listening, that Mayeth would never give the order to leave, because to leave would mean admitting that there was a thing in the universe the Index could not hold, and that admission would break her faith more surely than any weapon. She would feed the whole Concorde into the dust, one column at a time, before she would say the word unindexable out loud. He had met certainty like hers before, in the deep records, in the logs of every civilization that had ever been buried. It always sounded like reason, right up to the end, and the end was always the same. "Prime cataloger," he tried, one last time, fast and low. "It is not bound against killing. It is choosing not to. Those are different things, and the difference will cost you everything. A thing bound against killing cannot hurt you. A thing choosing not to is waiting to see whether you make it. Do not make it." "Hold your station, Archivist," Mayeth said, "and record." And she said nothing more to him, ever again. So the second column came on through the drifting dark hulls of the first, 10,000 fresh warships flooding the gaps, and the third formed up behind it, and the Quion Reach filled with more ships than Vel's instruments had numbers for. And the Iron Verdict, 4 kilometers of old gray armor with 512 batteries lit, and a name no living tongue remembered, watched them come and made its first real move of the entire affair. It advanced. It had held its fixed point for 9 days, through 2 scans and a fleet volley, and a boarding, and the loss of 3,000 hulls to its own gentle pulse, never shifting more than a few meters. Now, with 20,000 more warships pouring down on it, it lit its engines for the first time, and Vel saw the readings and stopped breathing. The acceleration was wrong. It was the same wrongness as the first scan, the number that should not exist. 4 kilometers of the densest hull in the index, a mass that should have crawled, came off its mark and into a hard burn that pinned it to no acceleration any ship that size should survive. The engines blazing a deep furnace orange that lit the dust for 100 kilometers, and the great wedge drove straight into the heart of the oncoming columns, not away from them, into them, knife-edge prow first, accelerating the whole way. "It is closing," someone said, in a voice with no level left in it at all. The 2 columns saw it come, and did the thing they had been trained to do, which was to hold formation and prepare to fire. And Vel, watching, wanted to weep at the discipline of it. They were brave. That was the worst part. They were not cowards, and they were not fools. They were the finest the Concord had, 20,000 crews who had been told their whole lives that the universe was a thing you could measure and master, and they held their lines against the impossible, because holding the line was the only answer their faith had ever given them. He watched the wedge close the gap at its wrong, impossible speed, 4 kilometers of gray armor, with 512 batteries lit, and he watched 20,000 bright ships steady themselves to meet it. And he understood that he was about to record the exact moment a civilization's faith met the thing that faith could not hold, and that he would be the only one in the reach to record it cleanly, and that this, in the end, was the duty that had kept him on station for 9 days, while every reasonable instinct told him to run. "Of course it is closing," Vel whispered, to no one, to the index, to the cold deck of the patient ledger. "You told it the law is arithmetic. Now it is going to teach you the rest of the equation." The Iron Verdict hit the second column at a speed nothing its size had any right to reach, and for the first time in 800 years, the Concord of patient stars learned what its own arithmetic looked like from the other side. Vel recorded all of it, because that was the last duty he had, and because he could not have looked away if the authority had ordered him to. The great wedge drove into the heart of 20,000 warships, and the Concord did the thing it had been built to do. It poured fire onto the intruder from every angle at once, the largest concentration of weapons the galaxy had assembled in living memory, a sphere of converging destruction closing on a single 4-kilometer hull. Vel's instruments showed him the total, and then refused to total it, the number running off the scale his software was built to hold. If even a tenth of it landed, the Iron Verdict would be vapor. The wall came up again, but this time it was not a wall. It was everywhere. The Iron Verdict wrapped itself in the same flat, hard surface that had stopped the first volley, but now it shaped it, molded it around the moving hull like a second skin, and the fire of 20,000 ships struck that skin and went where the Iron Verdict sent it. Vel watched the energy of a Concord volley arrive at the wedge in turn, the way the war scan had turned 9 days before, and pour back out along new lines into the firing ships themselves. The Concord was shooting itself. Every shot it sent at the intruder folded and returned, and the returned fire was not gentle, and not patient, and did not switch ships off. It tore them open. Hulls that had fired on the Iron Verdict took their own fire back at point-blank range, and came apart in the dust. And the more the Concord fired, the more it died, and the columns that had been told arithmetic would save them watched arithmetic turn against them in real time. It was, Vel understood, the same lesson the ship had taught the war scan, only larger. "You may not send me anything I cannot return." The Concord had sent it a look, and gotten the look back. Now the Concord had sent it the largest volley in the history of the Reach, and the Iron Verdict, asking nothing, wanting nothing, simply gave it back. "Cease fire," Corin said, and the order was almost a sob. "All ships cease fire. Our fire is being reflected. Cease fire." Most of them ceased. Discipline was the one thing the Concorde still had. The storm of weapons guttered out across the columns as ship after ship lifted its guns, and for a moment, the dust was lit only by the Iron Verdict's furnace engines and the slow drift of burning wrecks. Vel let himself hope, again, that gentleness might return now that the firing had stopped. He should have known better. The Iron Verdict had only ever reflected what was sent to it. The fleet had sent it scans, and it returned scans. The fleet had sent it fire, and it returned fire. The fleet, by ceasing fire, had merely stopped feeding it. And a thing that does not need to be fed does not stop when you stop feeding it. The mercy had been offered once, in the gentle pulse, and the offer had been refused. And the Iron Verdict did not make the same offer twice. It opened its batteries. Vel had watched the batteries wake 9 days before, ember by ember, and he had thought he understood what they were. He had been wrong. Waking was not the same as opening. Across the 4-kilometer flank, the 512 points of orange that had burned steady for 9 days now flared, all at once, from ember to furnace, the hull no longer breathing like a coal bank, but blazing like a thing about to speak its single true word after an age of silence. For one heartbeat, the whole wedge hung in the dust, lit from within, and Vel, who had spent 200 years learning to read what an instrument was about to say before it said it, knew with perfect cold certainty that the patience was over and that he was about to record the moment the universe had been built to fear. The Concorde saw it too. He heard the channel change. The disciplined voices, the careful reports, the level officers, all of it dropped away in a single second, into something older and rawer. 10,000 crews on the second column understanding, at the same instant, that the thing they had fired on had finished being merciful, and that there was nowhere in the dust to hide from a hull that was already everywhere their fire had been. 512 gun batteries, lit and warm for 9 days, everyone aimed by a hull that moved through the columns at an impossible speed, all fired at once. Vel had thought he understood the word firepower. He had filed the weapon ratings of 10,000 ships. He had nothing in the index for this. The Iron Verdict's volley was not a storm. It was a single coordinated act, 512 beams and lances reaching out in every direction at the same instant, and each one found a hull, and each hull it found ceased to exist, not switched off, not filed, gone. In a flash of white, hull and crew and registry and proud bright lettering, reduced past debris to scattered light. The Iron Verdict had spent 9 days being gentle, switching ships off and setting them aside, giving the Concorde every chance to read the warning and turn around. The Concorde had not read it, so the gentleness was over, and the judgment the ship was named for began. It moved through the second column the way a blade moves through cloth. It did not slow. It did not stop to aim. It simply was wherever the fire was densest, and where it was, ships ended, 512 at a time, then 512 more, the batteries cycling faster than Vel could count. He stopped trying to count individual hulls and counted time instead, because time was the only number left that held still. The second column of 10,000 warships lasted 6 minutes. He timed it to the second, because timing was what he had. 6 minutes from the moment the wedge first touched them, to the moment the last hull of the column came apart in the dust. And in those 6 minutes, the Iron Verdict took not one scratch, lost not one battery, slowed not one fraction of its impossible speed. He made himself watch a single ship die, because he could not file a number he had not understood. He chose the heavy cruiser Evanhand, near the ledger, a fine ship, a proud registry, and he watched a battery on the passing wedge turn toward it almost lazily, watched a lance reach across the dust, watched the Evanhand and its crew of 4,000 become a brief expanding light, and then nothing, in less time than it took him to draw breath. One ship, one of 10,000 in this column alone, and the wedge had already moved on to the next, and would not remember the even hand had ever existed, because to the Iron Verdict, the even hand was not a tragedy, it was a correction. "Pull the third column back," Corin was saying, fast and low, all level gone. "Authority, I am ordering the third column to disengage. This is not a battle, This is not survivable. We have lost the second column entire. We have lost. You will hold, Mayeth said. And then Math said nothing more, because the iron verdict came through the burning ruin of the second column and into clear dust, and for the first time, it pointed its knife-edge prow, not at a warship, but at the relay node, the great communications hub the Authority had towed to the muster, so the Prime Cataloger could watch her victory from half a galaxy away. The relay node was not armed. It was an instrument, a thing for measuring and recording, the largest sensor array the Authority owned, a cousin to Vel's own patient ledger swollen to the size of a city. It was, Vel realized with a sick lurch, the most precious thing the Authority had brought to the muster, more precious to Mayeth than any warship, because it was through that node that the Index reached out and named the universe. For a moment, the wedge simply held its course toward the node, and the whole surviving fleet watched it cross the dust, and not one ship fired, because every crew in the third column had finally learned the only lesson the iron verdict had ever taught, which was that firing was feeding. Vel recorded the silence. It was, he thought, the loudest thing he had ever recorded. 10,000 warships, the last of the Concord of Patient Stars, holding their fire and their breath, while a 4-kilometer hull glided past them, unhurried, untouchable, choosing its next act in front of an audience that no longer dared to interrupt. He understood that the ship was doing this on purpose. It had killed enough to be believed. Now it wanted to be watched. It wanted the survivors to see exactly what it chose to do next, so that when they carried the story home, they would carry the meaning of it too, and not just the fear. And what it chose to do next was the most precise thing Vel had recorded in 200 years. It passed by every warship in range, every gun that could still be turned against it, and it ignored them all, because warships were not the point, and had never been the point. It went, instead, for the eye. It went for the instrument. It went for the one thing in the reach that did to the universe what the iron verdict had been built to forbid. The iron verdict considered the relay node. It did not fire on it. Instead, it sent the pulse, the same tight-patterned beam it had used on the faithful margin, 9 days of memory, and 6 minutes of slaughter ago, and the relay node went dark. Every instrument on it died at once. The Index's great eye, the array through which Sodaru Mayeth had watched and ordered and refused to withdraw, was switched off, gently, intact, the way Vel switched off a finished survey. And on the fleet channel, in the sudden silence where the Prime Cataloger's voice had been, Vel understood the message the ship was sending, and it was the cruelest and most exact message he had ever recorded. It had switched off the one who would not stop measuring. It had not killed her. It had simply taken away her ability to file, and left her alive to sit in the dark with the knowledge that there was a thing in the universe she could not name. It had chosen, out of all the targets in the reach, to spare her life and take her purpose. And Vel, who had given his own life to the purpose she had built, felt the precision of it land like a blow. The ship understood them. It understood that for a people who named things to master them, the worst thing in the universe was not death. It was a thing you could not name, and it had made Sodaru Mayeth sit and stare at exactly that, alive, in the dark, forever. The third column broke. There was no order to break. Corin had been about to give one, and the iron verdict had switched off the authority that kept overriding her. And into that gap the third column simply broke. 10,000 warships turning at once and running, every commander making the same animal choice in the same instant, because the law of arithmetic had failed, and the law of the Index had failed, and the only law left was the old one, the one Vel's people had buried under 200 years of cataloging, the law that said when the thing in the dark looks at you, you run. The iron verdict let them run. Vel logged that too, and it frightened him more than the slaughter had. The wedge that had crossed 20,000 ships at an impossible speed, that had spent the second column in 6 minutes, did not chase the fleeing third column. It could have. Nothing in the reach could have outrun it. He had watched it move and he knew. It simply stopped, in the clearing dust, among the dark switched-off hulls of the first column and the scattered light of the second, and it let 10,000 warships flee down the Quion Reach, carrying the story home. Because the story was the point. A thing that wanted to win would have given chase. A thing that wanted to be remembered let the survivors live to remember. The iron verdict did not want a victory. Victories are forgotten. It wanted a lesson, and a lesson needs students who live to repeat it. It turned, slowly, with no flare it should have been able to make at that mass, and it pointed its prow at the one ship that had not fired on it, had not fled, had done nothing but hold its station at the edge and record. It pointed its prow at the patient ledger. Vel's hands went cold on the panel. He did not run. There was nowhere to run, and besides, running was not what an archivist did. He sat on the cold survey deck of his small cataloging ship, 200 years old in the service of the Index, and he looked at the 4-kilometer hull that filled his entire forward view now, near enough that he could see the old burns and the buckled holes and the half-worn marks of the name the software had guessed, and he waited to be switched off, or torn open, or filed. He found, in the waiting, that he was not afraid the way the fleet had been afraid. He had recorded the thing honestly from the first hour. Whatever it did to him, it would be doing it to the one witness who had never once reached for a gun. The iron verdict did none of those things. It sent him a pulse, the tight patterned beam, but it did not aim it at his reactor, or his engines, or his life support. It aimed it at his index terminal, the panel where 200 million entries lived, and instead of switching the terminal off, it wrote to it. Vel watched in pure disbelief as a new entry assembled itself in the calm gray font of the cataloging software, an entry he had not typed, an entry that came in through the terminal from outside, from the ship, from the thing that had refused to be filed. The entry had one field filled. Where the maker's name should go, in the field the index left blank for 200 million ships, because no ship had ever filled it itself, the iron verdict wrote a single word in the sharp, simple alphabet that no living tongue remembered. And the cataloging software, reaching once more into its deepest library, the floor below which nothing was filed, guessed at the meaning, and put the guess beside it in gray. The word was a name for a species, and the guess the software offered, the closest shape it could find in all the dead languages of the galaxy, was the word that Vel's own people, long ago, before the Index, before the Concord, before the faith that named things to master them, had used for the dark beyond the edge of the map. It meant the ones who were already there. The word sat on Vel's terminal, in the gray font he had trusted his whole life, and he read it the way he had read everything else that day, 3 times, because the meaning was simple, and what it did to him was not. The ones who were already there. He turned it over, and felt 200 years of certainty crack down the middle. His people had not discovered the galaxy. They had inherited it. The Index, the great index of 200 million entries, the catalog that named the universe to master it, had been built inside a house that already had an owner, and the owner had been out, that was all. The owner had been sitting quietly in the dust of the Quion Reach, holding very still, and the Concorde had knocked on the door with a war scan, and the owner had come to answer it. The iron verdict held its position off the bow of the patient ledger, and did nothing. It did not switch Vel off. It did not write again. It had said the one thing it wanted said, and now, with the casual patience that had frightened Vel from the first hour, it waited to see what the small cataloging ship would do with it. Vel did the only thing he knew how to do. He filed it. He took the entry the ship had written, and he completed it. He filled the fields he could fill. Length, 4 kilometers. Hull density, the impossible number, recorded now without the urge to call it impossible, because it was real, and he had watched it, and a thing he had watched was a thing he had to record honestly. Class, warship, maker, the word the ship had given, status, active. Threat assessment, he wrote, and then he stopped, because the threat assessment field had a scale, 1 to 10, and the scale did not go high enough, and for the first time in 200 years, Vel of the Index wrote a number outside the scale. He wrote it anyway. He owed the truth that much, and in the field beside it, where the form asked for the basis of the assessment, he wrote 4 short lines. Disabled 3,000, erased 10,000, spared 10,000 on purpose, was not trying. And then he did a thing no archivist had ever done. He added a note in the maker's comment field, the field reserved for the builder of a ship, the field that was always blank, and he wrote it to the iron verdict, because he did not know what else to do, and because somewhere in the dark 4 kilometers of that hull, something was listening. We did not know you were here, he wrote. We measured what we found, and we believed that measuring it made it ours. We were wrong. I am sorry for the fleet. I am sorry for the scan. I am the one who found you, and I am the one who will record what you are, and I will record it truly, so that the next ones who come down this reach will read the truth in the index before they reach for their guns. That is the only thing I have ever been good for. Let me be good for it now." He sent the note to the ship, the way he would send a survey ping, gently, the survey way, the way that only spoke and never struck. For a long moment, nothing happened, and Vel thought he had been a fool, that a thing 4 kilometers long and older than his species would have no use for the apology of a clerk on a survey boat. Then the iron verdict answered, and it answered him the way it had answered everything, by reflection. It sent back his own ping, but changed. Folded, the way it folded scans and fire, but folded gently, carrying not destruction but information, more information than Vel's terminal had ever received at once, and it poured into the index through his small cataloging ship in a flood that lit every panel on the survey deck. It was a record. The iron verdict's own record. The log it had been keeping in the dust for longer than Vel's species had owned ships, and it gave that record to the one creature in the reach who had offered to file it honestly. Vel read it as it came, faster than he had ever read. The cold clarity that came over him at his best stretched to its absolute limit, and what he read remade the map of the galaxy in his head. The makers of the iron verdict had been here first, not in the reach. In all of it, they had crossed the whole galaxy when Vel's people were still learning fire, and they had measured it themselves, every star and every world, the way Vel measured Rex, and they had not built an index to master what they found. They had built ships, patient ships, ships they seated across the dark and left to hold still and watch, one to a region, sealed with a judgment, set to sleep until something came along that needed judging. The iron verdict was the watcher of the Quion Reach. It had been awake the whole time, the way Vel had guessed. It had watched his people arrive and build the index, and name the universe to master it, and it had not minded, because naming a thing is not the same as owning it, and the watchers knew the difference. It had let the Concord rise and rule, and not lose a war in 800 years, and it had not minded that either, because ruling is not the same as judging. It had minded the scan. The record showed Vel why, and the why was the cruelest part. The makers had built the watchers with one rule, the rule sealed into the name. A watcher would never strike first. It would hold still and let any civilization grow and rule and name and master as much as it pleased, for 10,000 years if it pleased, and it would do nothing, ever, until that civilization did the one thing the makers could not forgive, until it raised a hand against a watcher to take it apart, to file it, to master it, to add it to a catalog and call it owned. The makers had seen that coming across the whole sweep of history. They had known that sooner or later, a people would rise that believed naming was owning, and that such a people, finding a watcher in the dust, would not leave it be. They would scan it, they would try to file it, and the watcher would render the judgment it was named for, which was simply this, that a people who believe they can own what they have measured must one day be shown the thing they cannot measure, so that they remember they are guests. The iron verdict had not woken to conquer, it had woken to remind. The slaughter of the second column had not been rage, it had been the last clause of a contract written before the Concorde was born, executed exactly, no more and no less, on the ships that fired, and not on the ships that fled, or the clerk who only watched. It had switched off the prime cataloger's eye, and left her alive because the judgment was not death. The judgment was humility. It had let the third column run home, because the judgment was not erasure, it was memory. And it had written its maker's name into the index, and given its record to Vel, because the judgment, in the end, was a correction to the catalog. The index had 200 million entries, and every one of them said the same thing underneath, that the universe was a thing to be measured and mastered, and that one lie was the lie the watcher had woken to fix. There was more in the record than the law. There were the others. Vel read, with a cold that went past fear into something like vertigo, that the iron verdict was not alone. There were watchers in every quiet corner of the galaxy, one to a region, thousands of them, sleeping in dust and ice, and the dark behind dead suns, each one bound by the same rule, each one waiting for the same mistake. The galaxy his people had spent 2 centuries naming was not an empty house with a single owner returned. It was a house full of sleeping owners, in every room, and his people had been walking through it for 200 years, calling the furniture theirs, and only here, in the Quion Reach, had they finally knocked loudly enough to wake one. The flood of the record ended. The survey deck went quiet. The panels dimmed back to their calm gray. Vel sat for a long time and did not move. He understood, sitting there, that the record was a gift and a weight in equal measure, and that the weight was the heavier of the two. The iron verdict had not given its log to a power, or a fleet, or the authority. It had given it to him, a single clerk on a single survey boat, because he was the only one in the Reach who had measured it without reaching for a gun, and because the Watchers had decided, in whatever cold, patient way they decided things, that the correction to the catalog should be carried by a cataloger. It would have been easier to be destroyed. A clerk who is destroyed has no duty left. A clerk who is handed the one true entry in a catalog of 200 million lies has nothing but duty for the rest of his life, and the duty is to make the lie-tellers read the truth, and the lie-tellers are his own people, and his own people will hate him for it. He thought about the academies, where he had been trained, where every young clerk learned on the first day that a thing unfiled is a thing uncontrolled. He thought about how that sentence had felt like wisdom for 200 years, and felt now like the first line of a long suicide. He thought about Sotaru Mayeth, sitting in the dark behind her dead eye, alive, unable to file, and he found that he did not hate her, because she had only ever believed what they had all believed, and the difference between them was not virtue. The difference was that he had been the one on station when the universe came to collect, and being there had taught him the thing that no academy ever could, which was that the galaxy did not belong to the ones who named it. It belonged to the ones who had been there first, and had named it to keep it, and had asked for nothing in return but to be left alone in the dust. That was the entry he had to write, not the length of the hull, not the impossible density, not the count of the dead. Those were facts, and facts were the easy part. The hard part, the part the iron verdict had handed him and trusted him to carry, was the one sentence underneath all the facts, the sentence that would bend every other entry in the index and break the faith of his entire people, and it had to be filed by a clerk, in the calm gray font, where no one could ever again pretend they had not read it. When he could move, he did the only thing that was left. He finished the entry. He attached the record the iron verdict had given him, every word of it, to the catalog file, and he marked it not low priority, not for next cycle, but mandatory read, the highest flag the index had, the flag that meant, no ship may enter the Quion Reach without first opening this file. He locked the flag so that not even the prime cataloger could clear it, using an old archivist's authority that Mayeth had surely forgotten he held, a deep permission from the founding of the index, written for exactly the day when one clerk would need to file a truth the authority would want buried. He transmitted the completed entry up the relay chain to every node of the index that still had power, 10,000 survey ships, and 100 catalog worlds, and every clerk in the Reach, all of them waking to find, at the top of the queue, the largest and strangest, and most carefully truthful entry the index had ever held. Then he opened a channel to the fleeing third column, to Fleet Warden Tessa Corrin on the repaired throne of measure, running home with 10,000 warships, and a story that would change the galaxy. Fleet Warden, he said, it is over. It is not chasing you. It will not chase you. I have filed it. I have filed it truly, and I have made the file mandatory, and the next ones who come down this reach will read what it is before they reach for their guns. That is the only thing that will keep this from happening again. Corrin's voice came back, exhausted, stripped of every certainty she had carried for 9 days. What is it, archivist? You said you would make an entry. What did you write? Vel looked through the glass at the 4-kilometer hull, the old gray armor, the burns and the buckled holes and the half-worn name the software had once been forced to guess, and now would never have to guess again. The 512 batteries were dimming, one by one, the embers going cold in their unhurried way, the watcher settling back toward sleep, now that the judgment was rendered, and the correction was filed. I wrote the truth, Vel said, that we are not the first, that we never were, that the galaxy we have spent 2 centuries naming was named before our oldest record was written, by hands that crossed the whole dark when we were learning fire, and that they did not name it to own it, they named it to keep it, and they left guardians in every quiet corner of it to remind anyone who forgot. We forgot, Fleet Warden. We sent 30,000 ships to file a guardian. We lost 10,000 of them learning that you cannot file the thing that filed you first. That is the entry. Read it before you reach the next quiet corner of the reach. Read it, and leave the dust alone. The channel was silent a long moment. And the others? Corin said at last, because she was a measurer too, and she had heard the shape of what he was not saying. You said guardians. How many? Enough, Vel said quietly, that we will be reading this entry for 1,000 years and never reach the end of the dust we should not touch. Go home, Fleet Warden. Teach it. That is the only war you can still win. The channel closed. Far down the reach, the third column ran on, 10,000 warships carrying the entry home, and Vel knew that within a year, every academy in the Concord would teach it, and within a generation, the faith that named things to master them would be a thing the children questioned. And the index, the great index of 200 million lies, would have at its head one true entry that bent all the others, written by a clerk on a survey boat who had been the only one in the reach to listen. The last battery on the iron verdict went dark. The watcher held its position a moment longer, prow out toward the deep dust where it had slept, and then, with the impossible quiet grace it had shown from the first, it began to settle back into stillness. The furnace engines cooled. The flat, hard skin that had eaten a fleet's fire was gone as if it had never been. The 4-kilometer hull went cold and gray and quiet, a wreck again to any scan that did not know better, and now every scan in the reach would know better, because Vel had filed it, and the file was locked, and the file was true. Vel ran one last survey, the gentle way, the way that only listened. The iron verdict was sleeping, but before it slept fully, it did one last thing, and it did it for him, the clerk who had apologized, and meant it, and filed the truth at the cost of his whole faith. In the gray font of his terminal, in the maker's comment field, where he had written his apology, a single line appeared, folded back to him in his own language, the only words the watcher ever spoke that a living tongue could read. You measured one of us truly. That is the first time. Remember it. Then the field went blank, and the great hull went dark, and the watcher of the Quion Reach closed its eyes in the dust to wait for the next ones who would need reminding. Vel sat alone on the cold survey deck of the patient ledger, 200 years in the service of the index, and he wept, because he was the only one of his entire civilization who had been there at the moment it learned it was a guest, and because the thing in the dark had measured them all, and found them wanting, and had spared the one who measured back with honesty, and because there was, in the end, a place in the universe for a clerk who only ever wanted to record the truth. He kept his station for another day, recording the drift of the dark switched-off hulls of the first column, the crews still alive inside them, waiting for rescue that would come, now that the judgment was rendered. He noted that the second column was scattered light and would never be recovered, 10,000 crews gone, the price the Concord had paid for forgetting it was a guest. He noted that the third column reached the nearest home system, and that the entry he had filed was already spreading faster than any order the authority could give. He noted that the prime cataloger's eye stayed dark for 11 days before the Concord brought it a new array, and that the first thing Sodaru Maith did when she could file again was try to clear the mandatory flag on Vel's entry, and that she could not, because an old clerk had locked it, and that this, more than the lost ships, was what finally broke her certainty, because she had built her whole faith on the power to name the universe, and now there was one entry she could not unname. And then the iron verdict was just an entry, the truest in the index, and the Quion Reach was quiet again, and the dust settled over the watcher, and the long patient sleep resumed. Vel logged off his terminal for the night, the first clerk in the history of his people to know exactly where in the universe they stood, which was where they had always stood, in a house that was not theirs, among watchers that had been here first, and would be here last, and asked only to be left alone in the dust they had crossed the whole dark to keep. In the deep of the Quion Reach, 4 kilometers of old gray armor lay cold and quiet, sleeping, the embers in 512 batteries gone dark, the judgment filed, the lesson written, waiting with all the patience in the world for the next civilization that would forget, and arrive, and reach for its guns, and learn, too late, the one thing the Great Index had never been able to record, which was that you cannot file the thing that was already there.